Okay, this is a lecture on the history of abnormal behavior, trying to put abnormal behavior in some historical context to look at how we've thought differently about it across time, which is important in terms of looking at the development of the way that thinking about abnormal behavior has changed, because it's a lesson in not only how we got to where we are, it's also a reminder that where we are now is not where we will be in the future. It is an ongoing process. Okay, so we'll cover overview of some different perspectives across time, and then talk about kind of what's happened in major eras. Kind of prehistory all up to the classical period, then post-classical, Renaissance, and then 19th century, all the way up to early 20th century to where we are now. Okay, getting started. Some historical perspectives of deviant behavior. Major psychological disorders have existed in all cultures across all periods of time. Now, let me be clear, this is qualified a bit. Not every disorder has existed, and certainly the disorders as currently named haven't always existed, but the problems, the difficulties that are described with these diagnostic categories, these disorders, they're not new problems. People have been depressed for a long time. People have experienced mania. People have experienced psychosis. Now, there are some disorders that are certainly wouldn't have existed a long time ago. A reading disorder, inability to read, that being a disorder, not a thing before people could read, right? Kind of a prehistoric era. That just doesn't make sense. Now, might there have been individuals that had some difficulties learning and processing information in the same way that people have difficulty processing information that have a reading disorder? Yeah, probably so. But for the most part, the difficulties people face now, they faced in some format previously. Now, the way these things manifest has certainly changed over time. Frequencies likely changed. And we definitely have seen an increase in several disorders. Even once kind of the name of the disorder comes into existence, we start tracking prevalence. We see increases in prevalence. Why might that be? Well, there's a couple reasons. One would be the societal, cultural changes with increased stress and demands on the psyche, on kind of human psychological functioning that are burdensome rather than kind of a more pastoral life where you're out farming, which farming can be stressful. You worry about the weather and all that. But it's a different kind of stress than kind of the tedium involved working in maybe a factory job, that 9 to 5 grind, 9 to 9 grind, whatever you're doing. And also, there are certain disorders that are going to be increasing in prevalence because people are living longer and able to live through more things, right? Where somebody might have had a disorder that was incapacitating before, if they couldn't look out for themselves, they may not have survived. They may not have survived long enough to procreate and pass on their genes and their experiences. But now, even people that have some significant challenges of living can live a full life. So are likely to see more disorders the longer people live, and the more people that are able to live and get support they need to keep on living. In terms of why we're talking about the perspectives and how they've changed over time, one reason it's important is because when you think about the perspectives about causes abnormal behavior, they're often related to what people believe appropriate treatment is for that behavior. And again, these things have varied widely across cultures, across time periods, and across worldviews, even today. And again, we certainly have a bias, a Western bias, that the way we see things is the way things are. And I'm going to teach you from a Western perspective in this class because that's the perspective I come from. The DSM-5, which we'll lean on heavily, is clearly a Western production. So that's just one kind of caveat to all the things we're talking about, is it's going to be limited to a particular worldview. So there's 3 dominant traditions we see throughout time in terms of how people have looked at abnormal behavior and psychopathology. One being the supernatural, right? So this is where people think that abnormal behavior is caused by something beyond observation, something superhuman, supernatural. And it could be a punishment from God, a punishment from the gods, could be possession by a demon, or witchcraft, or somebody's under the spell of the moon, right? So all these kinds of things where obviously this perspective had greater prominence earlier in our history, right? And as knowledge and science have advanced, it's become less pronounced, but certainly not gone. The biological perspective, which holds that there's some sort of internal disease process or some exposure to a pathogen that causes abnormal behavior, right? So there's a identifiable, explainable reason. So it's not magic, it's not some supernatural thing that's causing this, but it's something like an illness. Even if we don't know what the pathogen is, we don't know the thing that's causing it, we assume that it's coming from something, some sort of biological dysfunction. Or something introduced to the body, or some failure of some part of the body, right? And the third one being the psychological, which could probably be renamed psychosocial to kind of reflect how broad it is. And this is reflects the belief that abnormal behavior is related to some sort of environmental factors or a way of living, possibly individuals' personalities or relationships. So again, something that's human and part of human experience, but not necessarily biological, but a maladaptation of some sort of psychological process. Right? If you can, in some way, separate the psychological from the biological, which I think as you advance through your study of psychology, you realize that's pretty difficult to do. They're certainly intertwined. Okay, looking at early perspectives. In terms of prehistorical perspectives, obviously we don't really know for sure because it's prehistory, so it means we don't have written records for what people believed. But it's likely that they had supernatural explanations for abnormal behavior because based on other records, fossil records and whatnot, archaeological record, it suggests some supernatural explanations for other things that now have scientific explanations. So whenever things were difficult to understand in the prehistorical period, there was a tendency to explain away things with some sort of supernatural causation. There's related to this, there's some findings of skulls that seem to have had surgery done on them, right? Where at some points in time, scientists have thought, oh, well, this maybe was the result of this practice of trephining, where people were believed to be possessed by demons, and so you had to let the demon out of their skull by knocking a hole in the skull. Maybe, and there's disagreement among archaeologists and paleontologists and anthropologists about whether or not those skulls with holes in them really do reflect that practice or not. So maybe, but it seems likely that the supernatural explanation is one that held the most sway in a prehistorical period. Okay, fast forward quite a bit to kind of a classical period, ancient Greeks and Romans. You've got Plato, right, doing his writings about Socrates, influenced by Aristotle. In his dialogue, Phaedrus, Plato talks about two kinds of madness. Biological madness, there's that biological perspective, and then those irrational behaviors that defied social norms but were divinely inspired. And here he's referring to artists, creative people, suggesting they were mad, they were crazy, but it's kind of a good crazy, divinely inspired crazy, that they're different than the norms, that atypical, differing from cultural expectations. So at least two different of the perspectives at play here. A little bit of that supernatural, and then also maybe a little bit of the biological. And also later in the Republic, he talked about the need for a balance among the three components of the mind for a healthy personality, which at three components of the mind if you've read ahead, you know, that sounds kind of like Freud. Yeah, a little bit of prefiguring there, which is also a little bit of a psychological perspective, suggesting, okay, you need to have these different aspects of your mind. And again, mind and brain aren't the same thing. Mind is a psychological construct. So your mind needs to be balanced to be healthy. Now, around the same time as Plato, Hippocrates was practicing and writing, arguably the father of modern medicine, right? He was contemporary of Plato. And wrote, among other things, that deviant behavior was caused by disease, so very much a proponent of a biological perspective, and suggested that the brain was the seat of consciousness and emotion, which before that other authors, other thinkers, has just maybe the heart, right, was where the consciousness and the soul, the psyche, was located. Hippocrates, a little more on the nose here, figured it out. So that biological thing as well. But Hippocrates also stressed the importance of family stress impacting abnormal behavior. So, and again, Hippocrates, a physician trying to treat people who were having different maladies, including or likely some psychological disorders, would often suggest, you know, removing them from stressful situations, recognizing these kind of environmental psychological factors were playing a role. Now, following in Hippocrates' footsteps was Galen, another physician, which most notably was famous for introducing the humoral theory of psychopathology. So there are these 4 humors, or different substances in the body: blood, black bile, phlegm, and yellow bile. And too much of one of those relative to the others led to this imbalance, right? And that imbalance is what led to kind of an abnormal personality, disposition, or abnormal behavior. That's where we get the terms phlegmatic. Now, for a while, people thought, oh, how silly Galen with the blood and the bile, because of course, you know, to fix that, one thing you might do is bloodletting, so sticking some leeches in people, kind of gross. Because for a long time, people thought, oh, well, that was silly. But hey, Galen was so smart in terms of recognizing this idea of a chemical imbalances at play, and turns out he was right. Well, maybe not so much. More recent research coming out on brain science has led to kind of that kind of chemical imbalance theory, especially for depression, has lost a lot of its popularity. It doesn't seem to be the case that you have too much serotonin, too little serotonin. It has to do with serotonergic activity of the neurons, not necessarily of those certain neurotransmitters, too much of them being in the brain. It's much more complicated than that. And so this idea of a chemical imbalance led people down the wrong path, it seems, for quite a while. Nonetheless, it probably is helpful that there is this, to some degree, this biological theory is helpful in terms of treatment, not so much for the bloodletting, but because one of the other things that Galen suggested was you change their environment, because you can adjust these levels of these humors by having a different environment, different quality air. And kind of that environmental manipulation is something that we recognize now as being very important for good mental health. So again, even this early period, you don't just have one perspective dominant. You have a couple of perspectives being woven together, even among the same thinker or thinkers. Okay, after the classical period, moving into the Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages. And in many ways, culturally, a step back, many would argue. And so, not surprisingly, here we see the rise in the belief of demonology, right? So, abnormal behavior, getting away from kind of these thoughts of Hippocrates and Galen. Oh, maybe it's this biological thing, and we need to either have some sort of medical intervention or maybe give them a nice place to live away from the stresses of their family and life. No, we're going to go back to, well, it's the devil. Devil's making you do it. Or it's your sinfulness. So we're going to, you know, exorcism or chain you outside the church, which, like a lot of things in the Middle Ages, when people would be accused of being possessed, oh, listen to what they're saying, that they're clearly crazy and that's probably heresy, they must be possessed. let's lock them up. Well, one thing you could do by locking people up oftentimes was if you owed them money, you didn't so much have to pay it back. Or if maybe they had some land you wanted, well, maybe you could just take it now because, well, they're insane and they can't hold land anymore. So there were some political things and economic things at play in terms of the use of this thinking of demonizing people that had aberrant beliefs or aberrant behavior, some of which may have had psychological disorders, some of whom may have just been rebellious thinkers. But unfortunately, as we'll see throughout time, people have used charges of abnormal behavior to disempower people for a variety of reasons. You also have people talking about so the stress and melancholy or melancholia. So that influence of Hippocrates and Galen wasn't completely gone. There was still sometimes when people had these kind of maladies of abnormal behavior, when they had this melancholy, which is kind of like depression, the people, they'd be sent into the country or to baths for cure. And again, if you're going to be sent to your country estate or to these special baths for a nice, quiet, relaxing time, you're probably not the guy, wheeling the ox cart through the muddy path. You're probably royalty or some wealthy merchant, right? So what your abnormal behavior was characterized as being, indicative of some sort of possession or sinfulness, or whether, well, you're really stressed and you got a lot going on, and then the treatment that you'd be given for that was somewhat influenced by your station in life, right? Which is, again, something we still see today. If you're acting abnormal and you're super wealthy, you're not crazy, you're eccentric. If you exhibit those same behaviors and you're impoverished, well, you're a crazy person, right? So some things change, some things stay the same. In this time period, we also had the idea of lunacy, right? You had Paracelsus suggesting that movements of the moon and the stars affected people's psychological functioning, right? That's where you get the term lunatic from, lunar referring to the moon, which still strikes me as interesting that to this day, that idea is still embedded in our culture where, if somebody works in the ER and they say, well, yeah, it was crazy tonight, it must be a full moon. That idea that this, celestial body can affect our behavior, it's fascinating. Anyway, moving on, out of the Middle Ages, back into the Renaissance, so the return of the Enlightenment, right, knowledge and science back in ascension. So obviously we're going to see some less emphasis on the supernatural. And this time we also see asylums being built where people could be sent to if their behavior was abnormal. Although they weren't really in any way hospitals, like we would think of them today in terms of a psychiatric hospital or facility. They were really more akin to poorhouses, where if you, again, were acting abnormally and were poor and were becoming a public nuisance, you'd be sent to this asylum, somewhat for your protection, but also largely for society's protection, to kind of get you out of the way, off the streets where you wouldn't be a nuisance anymore. You're not necessarily going to seek get treatment, but there's this kind of congregation of these individuals, which we'll see eventually will lead to something different as these people are kind of being clumped together. Okay, early 19th century, the rise and fall of moral therapy. And when we talk about moral therapy, we're not talking about moral as in right and wrong ethics. This is kind of a more archaic use of the term, referring to more psychological, environmental manipulations, that type of therapy. So major figures, you have Philippe Pinel and his former patient, Jean-Baptiste Poussin, famous painting of Unchaining the Inmates at the Asylum, right, where they went in and said, or these asylums, these poorhouses where people were basically just housed, really a prison for people who hadn't committed a crime is what they were. And they were just, chained to the walls so they wouldn't hurt themselves or hurt each other and be controlled. And Pinel and Poussin went in and said, no, let's treat them like humans. and not like animals, and maybe they'll act like humans. And you had a lot of miraculous cures, right? You treat people humanely, you gave them fresh air, you gave them exercise, you gave them something to do, give them a job. Even if it's just doing some crafts, let them do some farming. These miraculous cures to people they thought were hopeless cases, that was, oh, they're so aggressive and dangerous, there's nothing we can do but chain them up. And they showed, no, do this, and a lot of them will be okay. Again, important note, not all of them. Some of them were probably pretty severely disturbed and maybe needed more than that. So it wasn't enough for everybody, but for a lot of people, this was great, and people did better. And because of the success, you had these things being repeated in England, William Tukey, and then Benjamin Rush in America, these famous psychiatrists who were over the psychiatric hospitals in their respective countries, experimented with some of these things they had heard about, this moral therapy, and it worked wonders. It's fantastic. Hey, this is great. But then the problems of overcrowding, right? So a couple of factors. We got the U.S. Civil War, at least in the States, and then post-Civil War, a big influx of immigrants. So with the Civil War, one thing that did was you had a lot of people fighting in really horrific, bloody battles, and then if you're injured in one of those horrific, bloody battles, you had some horrific, bloody medical treatment, right? So I'm sure some of you have read about these things, watching videos of these things of field amputations and whatnot. Pretty traumatic stuff, right? And so there were a lot of people who were involved in the war as soldiers, as support personnel who experienced significant trauma. And when you experience significant trauma, it places unique stresses on the psychological functioning of an individual. And so you had a lot more people who were going into these asylums, these psychiatric facilities, because of the war, right? Kind of these war wounds, psychic war wounds, if you will. In addition to that, post-Civil War, you had one of the big waves of immigration into America. And some of the immigrants, not all of them, but some of the immigrants would also eventually be sent to these asylums as well. Sometimes maybe they had abnormal behavior. Sometimes, again, they were undesirable in their community because they were immigrants, and so shifted away here. And then one of the important things about this influx of immigration is, even though the people working at these asylums, these institutes, their ancestors had, been here one or two, maybe three generations for a lot of them. These new immigrants, well, you're new here and you're not a true American, and they treated them much more poorly. And so the quality of care in these asylums and psychiatric facilities began to decline, in part because whenever they had the immigrants, they would treat them less well, and that kind of spread to how they would treat people in general. So you had that, and then you also had Dorothea Dix in the mental hygiene movement. Now, Dorothea Dix, heart in the right place, and did a lot of good in terms of she fought for better care for people and getting more people into asylums and hospitals. She still saw all these people who were in the streets and homeless, who would benefit from being in these asylums where this moral therapy was working. And so she advocated for communities to get involved, politicians to build more asylums, get more people in them, increase the processes by which you can get people into these asylums. And it was very effective, maybe too effective, right? Because you started having more and more people who were qualified to receive services, and they got more people in, but they didn't hire more psychiatrists or more therapists, more people to work with these individuals. And so again, the quality of care began to decline because you're just packing more and more people in. Add to that, this is also amidst again in the U.S., the Industrial Revolution, right, where people are leaving their farms and going to cities, working in factories, and with that you have the kind of the disintegration to some extent at this period, not completely, but to some extent the beginning of the disintegration of community, right? Where some individuals who maybe has some abnormal behavior, some psychopathology that maybe wasn't too severe, but they were just impaired enough that they couldn't really contribute, like they couldn't go work in a factory, right? But oh, they could work on the family farm, and we had enough people involved in the community that they could be cared for, and they could maybe move from house to house. We could put up with them for a while. Then we're going to send them Aunt Sally, and then they're going to go to Uncle Jerome, and we're going to move people around. Well, with the Industrial Revolution, and you no longer have those communities, people moving to cities. Now, when somebody has those kind of struggles, there isn't someone there to take care of them, and so that also led to more people being sent to these asylums, and that overcrowding led to really some abhorrent conditions ultimately definitely in the American psychiatric hospitals, where they were bad, they got better, and then they got really, really bad, worse than prison setting, kind of bad. In the same time, you have the resurgence of the biological tradition, right? Largely related to the discovery of there's this syndrome, general-paresis, which is late-stage syphilis, right? Which they figured out kind of accidentally that, oh, this is due to a bacterial infection, because they were, of course, hey, this person is acting weird. Let's inject them with blood from somebody who has malaria. That sounds like a good idea. Well, I guess it worked because the fever, the immune response to the malaria burned up the bacteria, and then eventually they discovered the actual spirochete, the bacteria that caused syphilis. So, oh, here's this pathogen that causes this disease, which causes this mental illness. Aha, we figured it out. All mental illness is caused by pathogens. It's just a matter of time before we figure out what the pathogens are. Yeah, that was kind of like the last one. There's no bacteria, there's no virus for depression. People for a long time thought there was. But the impact of this, to some degree, was, well, okay, if this thing had a biological cause, these other things have a biological cause too. If they have a biological cause, there must be a biological treatment. But because we don't know what the pathogen is yet, we don't know what the treatment is yet, there's really no point in doing the stuff we were doing with giving them exercise and fresh air, because they've got a bug in their system and we don't know how to treat it yet. So there's no point doing anything else because we know it must be biological. So again, this was good in some sense in terms of increasing research on the biological aspect of mental illness, but it really didn't work out too well for people who were suffering at the time, because it led to a decrease in efforts to do anything for them. Okay, early 20th century. Okay, so now start to split up. Before, we're talking about all traditions being present. Now look at maybe just biological, because we have more things happening more quickly as information develops. In the 1920s and 30s, you've got shock therapy and lobotomy being practiced. The shock therapy was introduced largely because somebody made the observation that, hey, you know what? This thing that we call schizophrenia, where they have these psychotic symptoms, it doesn't seem to happen with people with epilepsy. I bet the seizure activity prevents schizophrenia, which, by the way, that observation was incorrect. People with epilepsy certainly can have schizophrenia and have it just as likely to have it as somebody who doesn't have epilepsy. They're not related. But based on that errant observation, they came up with this idea of shocking people, first with insulin comas, and then later with electroconvulsive shock therapy. Right? And the idea being that, well, we're beginning to understand the brain is this electrochemical machine, and we just need to hit the reboot. So this shock will reset things. Now, if you're someone who is hearing voices, and you're talking to the voices, and you're seeing things that people don't see, and you're interacting with those, and then they hook you up to a machine, and they run some painful electrical current through your body, and they tell you that this is so you'll stop hearing things and seeing things. when they ask you, hey, so do you hear the voices anymore? How likely are you to say yes? Yeah, me too. Probably not. So sometimes they thought that these therapies were effective. Hey, great, it worked. Well, the report of symptoms certainly declined because people don't want to be shocked anymore. It hurt a lot, but really not an effective therapy. Lobotomy, arguably worse. This is where Edgar Moniz pioneered this, and you would go in and destroy part of the brain. Right? Take a sharp stick, shove it in, either the orbital socket up through the nose somewhere, just a little scrape, severing some connections in the brain, because we know exactly where to cut. Well, not really. So they would cause brain damage, and it would lead to these patients who were, aggressive and violent, suddenly being very manageable. Oh, were they cured? They were manageable. But were they cured? They were manageable. Right? They would sit quietly in the corner and drool, which was much easier for people taking care of them to deal with than when they were aggressively interacting with hallucinations and delusions. So lobotomy, pretty bad. But again, the people doing it weren't evil per se. They thought they were doing the right thing. They thought, okay, these disorders have a biological basis. We're beginning to understand that all behavior is influenced by the brain. So this abnormal behavior must be influenced by the brain as well. So we must be able to manipulate the brain to manipulate the behavior. Unfortunately, there were a lot of people who suffered because of that. Moving on to the 1950s, you have the discovery of some drugs. One of the major classes being the neuroleptics, which were thought to be these miracle drugs, right? They could treat the untreatable. And this is largely for people, again, with schizophrenia, psychotic disorders, where they would, given these drugs, they would stop having the positive symptoms of schizophrenia with hallucinations, delusions, and whatnot. And it was a time of unbridled optimism. We found it. We found the cure. People that before they had to be hospitalized, now given this drug, now they can be out of the hospital. There were some problems. And again, these drugs, some of them still used today in moderation. But you got to be real careful with them because there are some profound side effects, right? The early neuroleptics in particular have some side effects referred to as extrapyramidal side effects. They cause things like tardive dyskinesia, right? With the pyramidal neurons in your brain that control motor movements get affected, where you have these dyskinesias, these impairments of motor functioning, where you can't coordinate movements appropriately, both gross motor functioning and fine motor functioning. You have this kind of odd facial movements and your tongue rolling around your mouth, and then potentially also being fatal at high doses. And tardive dyskinesia, depending on the dose you've gotten of these neuroleptics, for some people was irreversible. So you've caused irreversible brain damage to these individuals with these drugs. Which the lesson we've learned, if you could say we've learned it, that we are continuing to learn, is we often have the discovery of some new class of drugs, which leads to this sense of optimism, which is fantastic. But then after the drugs are employed broadly, over time, people taking them for a couple of years, we begin to see the side effects that didn't show up in those limited lab tests that you do to get drug approval. And then the drugs get pulled off the market, they get changed, and then it's a work in progress, and that kind of optimism becomes tempered. So moving in that same time period as all this was going on, the psychological tradition also had some significant events. One of the big things, one of the huge influences would be psychoanalysis, right? Which you can trace arguably back to Mesmer. I mean, obviously, you can go before that, all the way back to Plato. But Mesmer was this character who probably a con man, but you've heard the term animal magnetism. That was Mesmer's deal. That people had this there was this invisible fluid that he could manipulate that was animal magnetism. And you have these big kind of seance type ceremonies where he would touch people and have these crystals, and it'd be down in like a dungeon basement type setting. This flowing robes, very dramatic guy. Run out of many towns in Europe when his cures were unsuccessful, but sometimes they were successful. And this caught the notice of Charcot, who was a respected neurologist who contributed a lot to our understanding of Parkinson's disease. But Charcot noticed, hey, you know what? This Mesmer, clearly a fraud, but wow, the power of suggestion is really impressive. I wonder if I could use this with some of my patients who have these kind of neurological symptoms that weren't likely to have biological causes. And the reason he knew they didn't have biological causes is because their neurological symptoms didn't make sense the way the body is wired, right? Where you have this glove anesthesia where you wouldn't have any feeling in your hand, but you would in your wrist and everywhere else. And the way the nerves work in the hand, that doesn't make sense, right? And nowhere else in your body, just in your hand, that shouldn't happen. So it must be something psychological and not biological. And so Charcot studied that a bit. And then the person that studied, and one of the people that studied under Charcot was Sigmund Freud, right? Also studying to be a neurologist. And Freud had the same interest in the power of suggestion and hypnosis, and then also studied under Joseph Breuer, right, famously working with Anna O, who was Bertha Pappenheim, looking at, okay, these people that have these neurological symptoms that shouldn't be biological, okay, I wonder if I can do this kind of suggestion stuff with hypnosis without the hypnosis part. What if I just have them talk? They just free associate and they talk about the kind of traumatic things in their early childhood, and he had success with them, right? So it went from Mesmer to Charcot to Freud via this kind of hypnosis line, where Freud eventually did away with hypnosis and developed this psychoanalysis, where people have this talking cure. People just talk about whatever came to their mind, and the idea being that whatever's really bothering them eventually will come to the surface, and that will lead to a relief of their symptoms. And that's a oversimplification, but in a nutshell, that's psychoanalysis. Significant ideas from Freud, the kind of tripartite model of the mind, which again, similar somewhat to 1,000 years before with Plato. The id, ego, and superego, right, are the three components, where the id is the source of your drives, the thing that wants what it wants, and it wants it now, kind of like a toddler. The superego being on the other end, kind of like the parent saying, no, don't do this, don't do that, that's bad, very kind of rule-driven, very moral. And then the ego being in the middle, trying to satisfy the wants of the id, the restrictions of the superego, and then also the realities of the world, and negotiating all that. Right? And so Freud said that a lot of what's going on in the mind is unconscious. Like the id is unconscious, the superego is unconscious, most of the ego is unconscious, so you don't know what's going on. You're not aware of the conflict. There's conflict there, and it bubbles up to the surface in the form of these symptoms, these sometimes conversion symptoms, where you have this weird paralysis or whatnot. And then you also have these defense mechanisms, which would be the abnormal behaviors we see, right? The overt behaviors, where you have these impulses that from the id that the superego are telling you are bad and you shouldn't want them, and then you have to keep the ego from being overwhelmed by the anxiety and the tension caused by that fight between the id and the superego, you have these defense mechanisms where you'll use like denial or projection or reaction formation, all these things to keep the ego from being overwhelmed, where you're distorting reality, distorting your own wants to keep your ego safe. And that distortion, those defense mechanisms, lead to this kind of neurotic, abnormal behavior. Okay. So you had that going on early 20th century. Not so popular in Europe, hugely popular in America. Even though Freud hated America, we loved him. This idea of sex and violence being just under the surface fit right in kind of puritanical America. So that's going on. And then somewhat in response to the popularity of psychoanalysis, we saw the rise of behaviorism, right? Which Pavlov really didn't have much to do with therapy, right? He was a Russian scientist studying salivating dogs, looking at the digestion of dogs. Won the Nobel Prize for this work on dog digestion, I think. But kind of somewhat accidentally, in doing this work with dogs, discovered, maybe rediscovered, depending on who you agree with in the history books, the principles of classical conditioning, right? Of learned behavior, where these, the dogs, he had them hooked up these tubes where they're salivating and he's measuring saliva. So he presents them with meat powder, and then they salivate, and he's seeing how the saliva works. But he had the problem, the dogs were salivating too early before he brought in the meat. Whenever they heard him coming, they would salivate. He said, that's interesting. They seem to know this thing is coming. They have learned to associate, the sound of my shoes, the sound of the door opening, whatever it is, with this other stimulus. There's this connection here. And he began to study how those connections are made, how they're broken, and that's contributed significantly to our understanding of abnormal behavior, especially in terms of fear behavior. We talk a lot about classical conditioning and operant conditioning when we talk about phobias. So Pavlov, again, not meaning to do work on abnormal behavior for humans, but inadvertently discovered some principles that we'll refer to repeatedly. John B. Watson, famous for scaring toddlers, right? The little Albert study, went further with the classical conditioning and showed how you could condition fear responses. You could train people to be afraid of things they weren't previously afraid of. Showed how you could have extinction of fear behaviors, which again is getting important in terms of the later treatment. But again, mostly focused on classical conditioning. And then B.F. Skinner, who worked with a variety of animals, most famously training pigeons, but getting animals to do things via rewards and punishments, right? So moving from classical conditioning to operant conditioning. So not just that, okay, two things can become associated, but we can have control over behavior. We can increase or decrease behavior depending on the consequence that the behavior gets, right? So when you do the behavior, you get something good. Okay, now I'm going to do the behavior more. You do the behavior, you get something bad. I'm going to do the behavior less, right? Or I take away something good, or I take away something bad. All these things with positive and negative reinforcement. Skinner did a lot of work with that, which again, not necessarily in his mind meant to be applied to therapy, but really a cornerstone of a lot of our understanding of psychopathology and also treatments of psychopathology in particular, anxiety disorders. In response to the two of these was the third wave in psychological thinking, which was humanism. You've got a couple of major figures. Two of the big ones, though, one being Abraham Maslow. One of his large contributions was this idea of a hierarchy of needs, right? Where at the top of that hierarchy is self-actualization. Down at the bottom you've got food and shelter, and then in between you have things like self-esteem, relationships with others, love, all those things. The idea being that at the base are things that, okay, these are things you need, and if you don't have the thing at the base, you don't care about the thing above it. But once you have the base need met, well, now the need above that has higher motivating power. And the idea being that as you get more of your base needs met, ultimately the highest goal, the highest motivating power is self-actualization. Self-actualization is becoming who you truly are and who you were meant to be. right? And that we all have this drive to do that, which is very different than kind of Freud's idea that, oh, we're all just animals held at bay by civilization. Well, humanists were more, no, people are good and they want to be better. They want to be fully realized. Some of whom had a more kind of theological bent, said people want to be kind of godlike and have this drive for this divine perfection. They would argue. So again, when people have abnormal behavior, they have disorders, it's because they're getting a need not met at some level, and so they're not able to focus on the higher levels. Not able to get to self-actualization because something's getting in the way down below. One of the other major figures in humanism was Carl Rogers, developed person-centered therapy. Okay, so we covered a lot of ground from the prehistoric period up to the early 20th century. Take-home message. Where are we now? Well, all three traditions are alive and well. Obviously, the biological tradition getting a lot of attention. Sometimes it seems to be old ideas repackaged as new ideas. We don't see electroconvulsive shock therapy much anymore. You still see it as a treatment for people that have severe depression or severe OCD that hasn't responded to other treatments. Some folks still use it for that, but it's used in a much more humane way. Still used. And then there are people pushing for things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which again, applying magnets to the brain. The idea being, oh, we should need to reset the computer. Which again seems a bit like an old idea repackaged, but maybe. And it's one of those things where you have to, well, let's see the evidence as it comes out. You can't prejudge and assume just because the way it was done before was bad and painful and costly to people doesn't mean that this new way won't work. Maybe it will. We'll find out. Other things, obviously, with the biological condition being psychopharmacology, using drugs to treat mental disorders, which depending on what disorder we're talking about, more or less successful, but overall, slightly better than placebo. Not a lot better, but slightly better than placebo, especially for more severe psychopathology. For more mild psychopathology, again, because things occur on a spectrum, for like a mild depression, drugs aren't going to be better than placebo. But for more severe depression, yeah, probably a little bit better. The psychological tradition, obviously alive and well. Psychoanalysis isn't a thing that really anybody does anymore, but there's still psychodynamic therapy, which is the offshoot of it. Some post-Freudian, neo-Freudian thinkers. And then behaviorism, still alive and well. It's kind of combined with, with the advent of computers and the rise of cognitive psychology in the 60s, combined into cognitive behavioral approaches. And then, of course, humanism is still there in the background. Most therapists have some Rogerian stuff mixed in with what they do, some sort of base of those therapeutic conditions. But we also have kind of a splintering in the field of psychological theory. We have kind of, no longer these large schools of thought. It's more, I do this little type or this little type. Oh, mine's this flavor, which when you read closely, a lot of them are the same thing. It's used in slightly different terms. Not a whole lot new under the sun. Sometimes new bells and whistles, things like EMDR. That's exposure therapy, which is based on Pavlov stuff and Watson stuff from a long time ago, just with a few more bells and whistles. And then the supernatural tradition, you might think, well, we're well past that. No, not so much, not so much. And again, it's not necessarily a bad thing because, maybe there are some supernatural things. There are pastoral counselors from Christian perspectives, and from their Jewish pastoral counselors, Muslim pastoral counselors, from a variety of faiths. There are people who get licensed as counselors, as therapists, who then proclaim that they are working from a particular religious perspective as well, and they will pray with, worship with, meditate with their clients. So that's still a thing. Yeah. As we've seen looking across time, there's not a linear progression from one perspective to the next. We didn't go from supernatural to psychological to biological, and now we're done, or supernatural to biological to psychological, and now we're done. No, all three have been there. They've kind of which one plays a larger role has changed over time. With, I think, supernatural probably not going to take the lead ever again, but it's also not going to go away. So right now it's kind of biological, psychological, and more realizing the connections between those two. But within that, there's still developments and changes, but not in a kind of linear way that, oh, we know this, now we've added this. Instead, it's kind of, as the next point identifies, it's more of a period of discovery followed by refinement. Oh, here's the thing. Oh, wait. Well, not quite that. A little bit of what we thought, but, of A, B, and C, A was right, B and C are wrong. Sorry. So we've got some forward movement, but it's often, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. With overall, we know more now than we used to, but we also have even more questions now than we ever had before. The last thing to kind of take away from all this, that the viewpoint of abnormal behavior that is prevalent in a culture, in a society, in a system, at any point in time, is influenced by more than scientific knowledge. Right? So there's what we know, what we think we know, and what we believe. Right? And what we believe is influenced by a variety of things, including our own kind of cultural history and baggage, as well as political and economic forces at play that have there's some reasons why they might benefit from one perspective gaining prominence over another, or seeing something one way versus another, right? If we can pathologize this particular group of people that does this particular thing, if we can say that, well, that's crazy, well, we can take away some of their power. We can keep them from becoming too powerful as a group, which will then protect our own power. And that certainly has happened throughout time and will always happen because we're people. So it's important to pay attention when people are telling you, oh, okay, that's abnormal behavior, that's psychopathology, and if you say why, and they say, oh, just trust me, well, don't trust them. Look deeper, figure it out. What's the science behind what they're saying? What's the quality of the evidence, and where does that evidence come from? Because it's not as straightforward as, okay, we've discovered the elements, and here's what they are. It's much more squishy and much more influenced by subjectivity than some of the harder sciences. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.